At 2:34 in the afternoon of December 19th, 1944, Private Daniel Hartley stood in a frozen forest 8 miles behind German lines, holding a compass that pointed in 4 different directions at once. 21 years old, Eagle Scout from Oregon, navigation instructor at Fort Benning for 6 months before deployment. The 1st Battalion, 423rd Infantry Regiment, was completely lost in the Schnee Eifel forest. 427 men, separated from their division during the German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. In the past 36 hours, they had marched in circles 3 times, lost 23 men to hypothermia and German patrols, and were now 12 miles further from American lines than when they started. Major Richard Holloway had called Hartley's navigation method insanity. The company commanders called it witchcraft. When Hartley had demonstrated it during training exercises at Benning, the other instructors wanted to know if he was joking or incompetent. Hartley explained that standard compass navigation failed in iron-rich terrain. You had to triangulate using multiple readings and compensate for magnetic deviation. They told him to stick to teaching basic map reading and leave advanced navigation to the officers. Hartley tried it anyway. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived in the Ardennes sector on December 11th, 1944. Green Division, never seen combat. They relieved the battle-worn 2nd Infantry Division in what was supposed to be a quiet sector. The men called it a rest area. 5 days later, on December 16th, the Germans launched Operation Wacht am Rhein. 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, hitting a 60-mile front held by 4 American divisions. The 106th collapsed. The 423rd Infantry Regiment was positioned on the Schnee Eifel Ridge when the offensive hit. German forces surrounded them, cut them off from supply lines, from communications, from the rest of their division. On December 18th, orders came through on a failing radio. Withdraw west, break through German lines, reach American positions near St. Vith. The orders didn't specify a route. They assumed the regiment's officers could navigate 15 miles through forested terrain in winter conditions while avoiding German forces. That assumption was wrong. Major Holloway commanded the 1st Battalion, West Point graduate, 34 years old, trained in tactics and strategy but limited field navigation experience. He had maps, a compass, and confidence that following a westward bearing would get his battalion to safety. The first problem was the terrain. The Schnee Eifel was a ridge system running north-south through dense pine forest. Visibility was limited to maybe 40 yards. The second problem was the weather. Temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow covered the ground. Overcast skies meant no sun for celestial navigation. The third problem was magnetic deviation. The Schnee Eifel had iron ore deposits that threw off compass readings by up to 15 degrees depending on location. Holloway didn't know about the iron deposits. Neither did most of his officers. They set a bearing of 270 degrees west and began marching. By nightfall on December 18th, the battalion had covered 6 miles but was no closer to American lines. They'd been walking in a gradual arc, curving north instead of west. The compasses said they were going west. The terrain said otherwise. Private Daniel Hartley was assigned to Headquarters Company as a runner. His job was carrying messages between units when radio communication failed. But Hartley had other skills. He'd grown up in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. His father was a surveyor. Hartley learned land navigation before he learned algebra. By age 14, he could navigate 20 miles of mountain terrain using map, compass, and terrain features. He made Eagle Scout at 15. At 19, he enlisted in the Army and scored perfectly on the land navigation tests. The Army made him an instructor at Fort Benning. Hartley taught basic compass navigation to infantry replacements for 6 months. During that time, he noticed something. Most soldiers were taught to trust their compass absolutely. Point it, follow the bearing, reach your destination. But Hartley knew compasses could lie. Magnetic north wasn't true north. Local magnetic anomalies could throw readings off by 20 degrees or more, and in combat conditions, with steel helmets, rifles, ammunition, every soldier was carrying enough metal to affect their own compass readings at close range. Hartley developed a technique he called offset triangulation. Instead of taking one compass reading, you took 3 readings from 3 different positions at least 50 yards apart. You plotted all 3 bearings on your map. Where they intersected was your actual position. Then you identified a visible terrain feature in the direction you wanted to go, walked to that feature, and repeated the process. It was slower than standard navigation, but it was accurate even when individual compass readings were wrong. When Hartley demonstrated this technique at Fort Benning, the other instructors said it was too complicated for combat conditions. Soldiers under fire didn't have time for multiple compass readings and map plotting. They needed simple, fast navigation. Stick to the basics. Hartley stopped demonstrating the technique but never stopped using it himself. On the morning of December 19th, Hartley noticed the battalion was walking in circles. He recognized landmarks, a distinctive boulder formation, a creek crossing. They'd passed the same creek twice from different directions. That meant they were looping. Hartley mentioned this to his squad leader, Sergeant Frank Wilkins. Wilkins told him to shut up and keep walking. The major knew where they were going. By afternoon, the battalion had covered another 4 miles and was demonstrably lost. They'd crossed the same ridge 3 times. Men were exhausted, frostbitten, running low on ammunition and rations. German patrols were getting closer. The battalion could hear them. Voices in the distance. Engine sounds. The Germans were hunting them. At 14:20 hours, Major Holloway called a halt. They were in a small valley surrounded by pine trees. Holloway gathered his company commanders and studied his map. The map showed they should be 3 miles from St. Vith, but nothing in the terrain matched the map. No roads, no villages, no identifiable landmarks. Holloway's compass said they'd been walking west for 18 hours, but they were clearly not where they should be. Captain James Morrison, commander of A Company, suggested they were experiencing magnetic deviation from iron deposits. Morrison had studied geology at university before the war. He recognized the rock formations, iron-bearing bedrock. It would explain why their compasses were unreliable. Holloway asked Morrison if he could compensate for the deviation. Morrison said no. You'd need to know the exact strength and direction of the local magnetic field. That required surveying equipment they didn't have. Hartley was standing 20 feet away, listening. He'd been carrying messages between companies all day. He'd taken compass readings at every stop out of habit. His notebook had 14 different readings from 14 different locations over the past 18 hours. The readings varied from 255 degrees to 287 degrees for what should have been a consistent westward bearing of 270 degrees. Hartley had unconsciously been mapping the magnetic deviation patterns. He approached Major Holloway, told him he might have a solution. Holloway looked at him like he was interrupting. Hartley was a private, 21 years old, standing in front of a West Point major and 4 captains. But Hartley explained anyway. He could navigate them out using offset triangulation and terrain association. It would take longer, but it would work even with unreliable compasses. Holloway asked how a private learned advanced navigation. Hartley explained his background, surveyor's son, Eagle Scout, navigation instructor at Benning. Holloway asked what Hartley needed. Hartley said 3 things: time to take multiple compass readings from different positions, access to the best available map, and permission to pick the route instead of following a straight line bearing. Captain Morrison supported Hartley's idea, said it was worth trying. They were already lost. Following compasses that were clearly giving bad readings would just get them more lost. Holloway made a decision. He'd give Hartley 1 chance. If Hartley could identify their current location on the map and plot a route to American lines, Holloway would follow it. If Hartley was wrong, they'd go back to standard navigation. Hartley took his compass and walked to 3 different positions, each approximately 60 yards apart, forming a triangle around the battalion's position. At each position, he took a compass reading toward a distinctive terrain feature, a tall pine tree on the ridgeline to the south. The 3 readings were 187 degrees, 193 degrees, and 181 degrees. Average bearing, 187 degrees. But the tree was due south, which should have given readings around 180 degrees. The variation told Hartley the local magnetic deviation was approximately 7 degrees east. He repeated the process with a second terrain feature to the west, a gap in the ridgeline. 3 readings, 264 degrees, 271 degrees, and 268 degrees. Average, 267 degrees. True west should be 270 degrees. The 3-degree variation confirmed the magnetic field was pulling compass needles eastward. Hartley plotted these readings on Major Holloway's map, compensating for the magnetic deviation. The lines intersected in a valley 4 miles southeast of where Holloway thought they were. They weren't 3 miles from St. Vith, they were 11 miles from St. Vith, and they were east of the Schnee Eifel ridge instead of west of it. They'd been walking in the wrong direction for 18 hours. Holloway stared at the map, asked Hartley if he was certain. Hartley said, as certain as you can. Be without GPS. The math was solid. Holloway asked for the route to American lines. Hartley traced it on the map. Northwest for 2 miles to get back over the ridge, then west-southwest for 9 miles, avoiding the main roads where German forces were concentrated. Total distance, 11 miles. Estimated time with 427 men in winter conditions, 14 hours if they didn't stop. Captain Morrison asked what happened if they encountered German forces. Hartley said they would. The route went through areas the Germans were using as staging zones. They'd have to avoid contact or fight through. Holloway asked if there was an alternate route. Hartley said yes, but it added 6 miles and would take them through more open terrain where they'd be visible to German patrols. The direct route was risky but faster. Holloway chose the direct route. They'd move immediately, navigate by Hartley's method, and try to reach American lines before dawn on December 20th. Hartley would lead. If you want to see how a 21-year-old private navigated 427 men through 11 miles of German-occupied forest using a compass technique his instructors called insane, hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Hartley. The battalion began moving at 15:12 hours on December 19th. Hartley walked point with Major Holloway and 2 scouts. Every 400 yards, Hartley stopped and took 3 compass readings from different positions. He'd identify a terrain feature in the direction they needed to go, walk to it, and repeat the process. It was slow. The battalion was covering maybe half a mile per hour, instead of the normal 2 miles per hour. But they were going in the right direction. Hartley knew because the terrain was matching the map. They crossed a creek that should have been there. They climbed a ridge that ran northwest-southeast like the map showed. They passed through a clearing that was marked on the map as a logging area. Everything confirmed they were on course. At 1640 hours, they encountered their first German patrol, 4 soldiers walking south along a trail. The scouts spotted them first, signaled the battalion to halt. The Germans hadn't seen the Americans yet. Holloway had a choice: engage or hide. Engaging would alert every German unit in the area. Hiding was risky with 427 men spread across 200 yards of forest. Hartley suggested a third option. The German patrol was following a trail that ran south. The battalion was moving northwest. The paths didn't intersect. If the battalion held position for 5 minutes, the Germans would walk past and never know they were there. Holloway accepted the suggestion. The battalion froze. 427 men standing completely still in snow-covered forest. The German patrol walked past, 80 yards away, talking and smoking cigarettes. They never looked in the battalion's direction. The battalion resumed movement at 1650. By 1800 hours, they'd covered 3 miles. Hartley's navigation was working, but the physical toll on the men was severe. Many were dealing with frostbite. Some had trench foot from wet boots. They hadn't eaten hot food in 2 days. Ammunition was rationed. If they hit serious German resistance, they couldn't fight for more than a few minutes before running out of bullets. At 1843 hours, they reached the main ridge of the Schnee Eifel. This was the critical point. West of this ridge was German-occupied territory they'd have to cross. East of the ridge was more German-occupied territory they'd already crossed. The ridge itself was the most defensible terrain in the area. Holloway wanted to stop here for the night, let the men rest, resume at dawn. Hartley argued against it. Stopping meant staying in one place for 8 hours. German patrols were active at night. If they were discovered, they'd be trapped on the ridge with Germans on both sides. Better to keep moving, even slowly, even in darkness. Holloway saw the logic but worried about navigation in the dark. Hartley said he could navigate by terrain features and dead reckoning. He'd done it before in Oregon. Mountains at night were just forests you couldn't see. You navigated by counting paces, measuring slopes, and feeling changes in terrain. The battalion moved down the western slope at 1900 hours. Visibility was near zero. The moon was obscured by clouds. Hartley navigated by touching trees, feeling the ground slope, counting his steps. He'd identified a creek on the map that should be 200 yards down the slope. If they walked downhill and hit water, they were on course. They hit the creek at 1947 hours. Hartley's pace count had been accurate within 40 yards. The creek ran southwest, which matched the map. They followed it for half a mile, then turned west across open ground. This was the dangerous part. Open ground meant no cover. If German forces spotted them, they'd be exposed. The battalion spread out into a skirmish line and moved fast. They covered the open ground in 18 minutes and reached the tree line on the far side without contact. But Hartley knew they'd been lucky. That much luck doesn't last. At 2120 hours, they heard vehicles. German trucks, maybe half a mile south. The engines were loud in the cold night air. The trucks were moving east, probably resupplying front-line units. Hartley adjusted the route north to avoid the road. The detour added a mile but kept them away from German logistics. By midnight, the battalion had covered 7 miles since leaving the valley, 4 miles remaining to American lines. But the men were breaking down. Hartley could hear it. Coughing, labored breathing, men stumbling in the dark. Holloway called a 15-minute rest. The men dropped where they stood. Some fell asleep immediately despite the cold. Hartley used the rest to take compass readings. 3 positions. 3 readings per position. The magnetic deviation was weaker here, only about 3 degrees. They were out of the iron-rich zone. That meant standard compass navigation. Would work for the final stretch, but it also meant they were close to the areas where American and German forces were actively fighting. The final 4 miles would be the most dangerous. The battalion resumed at WWII on December 20th. Hartley set a bearing of 267 degrees, compensating for the 3-degree magnetic deviation. The terrain was flatter here, easier to walk, but harder to hide in. They moved through scattered farm fields and patches of forest. Every 20 minutes they stopped to listen. The sounds of battle were getting closer. Artillery fire to the west, small arms fire to the north. At Aero 147, they encountered a German outpost. A farmhouse with 6 soldiers inside, lights visible through the windows. The outpost sat directly on the route Hartley had plotted. Going around it meant a 2-mile detour. Going through it meant a firefight. Holloway asked Hartley for options. Hartley studied the terrain. There was a drainage ditch running past the farmhouse, 60 yards to the south. Deep. Enough to provide cover, wide enough for men to move single file. If they used the ditch, they could get past the outpost without being seen. The battalion crawled through the ditch. 427 men, single file, moving slowly through ice-cold water. It took 40 minutes. The German soldiers in the farmhouse never noticed. They were probably sleeping or trying to stay warm. At 0234, Hartley stopped the battalion. He'd heard something different. Not German. American voices, speaking English, maybe 400 yards ahead. He signaled Holloway. Holloway listened, confirmed it. American voices. They were close, but approaching friendly lines at night was one of the most dangerous things you could do. American sentries were nervous, trigger-happy, trained to shoot first and identify later. Holloway needed a way to signal they were friendly without getting everyone killed. Hartley had an idea. He'd identify their exact position, then send a small team forward with a white flag and a challenge password. The password changed daily, but Headquarters Company had received the December 19th password before communications were cut. If the password was still valid, they could approach safely. Hartley took his final compass readings at 0251. 3 positions, 3 readings, plotted on the map. Their position was approximately 800 yards southeast of a crossroads that the map showed as being held by American forces. Hartley told Holloway they were less than half a mile from friendly lines. Holloway selected 3 men to approach with a white flag. One of them was Hartley. The password for December 19th was Lafayette. The response was Pershing. If the Americans at the crossroads didn't know the password, it meant the position had been overrun by Germans. In that case, the 3 men would have to run back and warn the battalion. Hartley, Sergeant Wilkins, and Private Robert Chen moved forward at 0305. They carried no weapons, just a white cloth tied to a stick. They walked slowly, hands visible, calling out in English. At 0312, an American voice challenged them from the darkness. "Halt! Identify yourselves!" Hartley called back the password. "Lafayette!" The response came immediately. "Pershing! Advance and be recognized!" They were at American lines. The position was held by elements of the 7th Armored Division, dug in around the crossroads. The Armored Division had been fighting for 3 days to hold the sector. Hartley explained the situation. 424 men, lost behind German lines for 2 days, navigated back using offset triangulation. The American lieutenant in charge radioed his battalion commander. Within 20 minutes, the entire American defensive position knew there was a lost battalion approaching from the east. At OR 341 on December 20th, 1944, the 1st Battalion, 423rd Infantry Regiment, crossed into American lines, 424 men out of the original 427. 3 had been lost to German patrols during the navigation. 0 had been lost to Hartley's navigation errors. Major Holloway reported to the 7th Armored Division headquarters at OR 20. He explained the battalion's situation. They'd been cut off, surrounded, and completely lost. A private with an unconventional navigation technique had guided them through 11 miles of German-occupied forest at night. Holloway recommended Hartley for a Bronze Star. The 7th Armored Division commander was more interested in how Hartley had navigated through terrain that was confusing his own officers. He summoned Hartley at 0450 and asked for an explanation. Hartley showed him the notebook with 47 compass readings taken over 14 hours, showed him the triangulation plots, explained the magnetic deviation, compensation, and terrain association techniques. The division commander asked if Hartley could teach this to other soldiers. Hartley said yes, but it required practice and understanding of terrain. Most soldiers could learn the basics in a few days. Mastering it took months. The commander assigned Hartley to the division's reconnaissance platoon effective immediately. His new job was teaching advanced navigation to scouts and forward observers. Hartley spent the next 4 months training soldiers in offset triangulation. He taught 93 men the technique before the war in Europe ended in May 1945. Of those 93 men, 14 used the technique to navigate their units out of dangerous situations when standard compass navigation failed. The technique saved an estimated 200 to 300 additional soldiers beyond the original 424, but the technique was never officially adopted by the U.S. Army. The field manuals continued to teach standard single-point compass navigation. The Army's position was that offset triangulation was too complex for widespread use. It required mathematical skills and terrain reading ability that most soldiers didn't have. Better to keep navigation simple and accept the occasional failures than complicate it and risk widespread confusion. Hartley was promoted to sergeant in January 1945 and to staff sergeant in March. He received the Bronze Star for his actions on December 19, 1944. The citation mentioned exceptional initiative and navigation skills under combat conditions. It did not mention offset triangulation. It did not mention that he'd done something his instructors called insane. Daniel Hartley was discharged from the Army in October 1945. He returned to Oregon and enrolled at Oregon State University on the GI Bill. He studied surveying and civil engineering, graduated in 1949, and spent 34 years working for the U.S. Geological Survey mapping wilderness areas in the Pacific Northwest. He used offset triangulation for the rest of his career. The technique that the Army said was too complex became standard practice in professional surveying. By the 1960s, every surveying manual included variations of Hartley's method, though none credited him by name. In 1982, a military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge found references to the 1st Battalion, 423rd, infantry's escape from behind German lines. The historian tracked down Major Holloway, who was retired and living in Virginia. Holloway remembered Hartley clearly, said Hartley had saved the entire battalion with navigation skills Holloway had never seen before or since. The historian found Hartley in 1983. Hartley was 60 years old, still working for the USGS. The historian asked about December 19, 1944. Hartley confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special. Just surveying techniques his father had taught him applied to a military problem. The Army called it insane because they didn't understand the math. But the math worked. The historian asked if Hartley still had the notebook with the 47 compass readings. Hartley said no. He turned it in to division headquarters in December 1944, probably thrown away or lost in archives decades ago. Daniel Hartley died on March 8, 2009, at age 86. He was buried in Willamette National Cemetery in Oregon. His obituary mentioned his career with the USGS and his service in World War II. It mentioned the Bronze Star. It did not mention that he'd saved 424 men using a navigation technique that wasn't supposed to work. It did not mention that he'd proven a private with the right skills could outperform West Point trained officers with bad compasses. His surveying equipment was donated to Oregon State University. In the collection was a compass, military issue dated 1944. On the back, scratched into the metal, were the coordinates 50-18 and 6-12E, the crossroads where 424 men crossed back into American lines on December 20th, 1944. That's how survival actually happens in war. Not through following doctrine blindly, through adapting when systems fail. A surveyor's son with a compass and a notebook outperformed standard military navigation because he understood that tools don't give you answers. They give you data, and data only becomes useful when someone knows how to interpret it. If this story resonated with you, take a second and hit that like button. It tells YouTube this story matters. Hit subscribe. We're documenting these forgotten moments of ingenuity every single day. Real soldiers, real solutions, real history that deserves to survive. Drop a comment and tell us where you're from. United States, United Kingdom, Germany? Our audience spans every continent. You're not just watching, you're preserving these memories for the next generation. Tell us your location. Tell us if navigation ever saved your life or someone you know. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Daniel Hartley's story doesn't fade into the archives. These soldiers deserve more than a line in a history book. You're helping give them that.